This lecture looks at the July Monarchy that follows the Restoration with the Bourbons and a more middle-class friendly king that is going to be put in their place. Now, the Three-Day Revolution, as it became known, overthrew the Restoration government, otherwise known as the Bourbon Monarchy, in July of 1830. Charles X deposed, or was deposed, in 3 glorious days, establishing a new monarchy that would last from 1830 to 1838. Here, in his Liberty Leading the People of 1830, we have the unofficial symbol of the French Republic to this day, whereby we're looking at the revolution that place in 1830, much like the national icons that we have, such as Liberty Enlightening the World, otherwise known as the Statue of Liberty, or Washington crossing the Delaware. That's how important this painting is to the French. In the work, we have Charles X, the Bourbon king, overthrown by the French people, all classes rising up simultaneously, seen here in the background, to put into place Louis-Philippe, the new citizen king, who was more moderate and appreciated middle-class industrialists. So in this, we find that all of France rises up simultaneously of different classes and races and backgrounds, from the middle class with a top hat, to the working class, to soldiers. All are going to be following Lady Liberty, this allegorical figure in the foreground with her chest bared, holding a rifle and carrying the French tricolor flag, which is not yet the official flag of France. It is the revolutionary tricolor, not that adopted yet by the French government. We find that she leads them over this barricade where they're going to be triumphing over the soldiers, representing Charles X's rule. And we find that they... Here we have the allegorical Liberty holding a musket and the French tricolor, which was the revolutionary flag, again, importantly, not the official flag of France at the time, and leads all classes of people, artisans, peasants, students, and factory workers, all rise up simultaneously, all together, joining one another in this revolution. Here, they're going to be marching over a barricade, which would be a barrier built by revolutionaries to halt government troops. The bodies of a royal guard and a worker, both are victims of the revolution, are going to be trampled on here. Now, this is unique in Delacroix's oeuvre in that it's showing a contemporary event, thus combining real and allegorical figures together. A very interesting combination. If you compare this to Géricault's The Raft and the Medusa, you see the similarities with the offset, asymmetrical, pyramidal composition, with the dramatic lighting, with the loose brushwork and warm colors, all telling us a story very emotionally, not rationally. And we find that in order to communicate how we should join in, that we are part of this revolution, the scene is not going to move into, away from us, as we see with the Raft and the Medusa, but instead comes out at us as she is charging this barricade, carrying the flag, and running into our space. A very dramatic presentation that appropriately represents the national icon of the French people. Now, the July Monarchy Revolution is going to use Romanticism, as you see here, just as the French Revolution would use neoclassicism and the ideas from Greco-Roman antiquity. Critics of the work would refer to the allegorical figure wearing the Phrygian bonnet as a fishwife or a whore, thus not very fondly representing her as an allegorical figure of France itself. This does, however, have a precedent in the Restoration works that brought together real and allegorical figures, combining with Romanticism here something that is unidealized with real figures for a new allegorical language. Now, the uprising would replace Charles X with Louis-Philippe, again, the King of the French. And he would not rule by divine right, but instead by popular acclaim and a constitution. Now, smartly, he supports the middle class, whereas he's going to also consider that he needs to make everyone happy. So he does support the middle class, but considers the Bourbons, the supporters of the monarchy and legitimists, as they are known, as well as the Bonapartists and the Republicans. Compromise becomes the name of the game during this period, trying to make all of these constituencies happy. Hence, a new style comes about, known as the juste-milieu, the just middle, a happy mean. This new approach in the juste-milieu would begin with the division between classicism and Romanticism, synthesizing the two. Thus, the developments during the July Monarchy will focus on these four areas. We see developments in landscape painting, as well as historical and Orientalist themes, the popularization of high art, and finally, the explosion of printing that leads to popular visual culture that we will continue talking about in the next lecture. The philosophical justification for this new approach with the juste-milieu comes by way of systematic eclecticism espoused by Victor Cousin, who was a philosopher and teacher of the day, who claimed that the perfect philosophical model must combine elements of all others. Now, Charles Baudelaire, the art critic and poet, would thus divide artists into the three different categories, or as he would call them, linearists, colorists, and doubters. Now, of course, this is meant to be satirical, but this falls in line with the classicists, romanticists, and those in the middle course, the juste-milieu, who didn't want to commit one way or the other. The state of affairs can be seen in the satirical cartoon by Bertal of 1846, whereby we find Delacroix and Ingres, the two main artists representing classicism and romanticism, are in the center of the cartoon. Delacroix holds up a bag of pig bladder filled with color, labeled Color Law, and a placard down below. It says, "Line is myth." Ingres, on the other hand, points to the line on the ground with a placard that says, "There is only gray, nothing but gray, and Monsieur Ingres is its prophet." Down below, we find that most other artists wander off on their own in the juste-milieu, not siding with one or the other of these extremes. Off to the side, painting on this massive, massive wall, is Horace Vernet, who paints one of his battle scenes by himself, taking a journalistic approach that is not easily classified. Such an approach was ideal for Louis-Philippe, the Citizen King, who would use propaganda to unite a divided country, not to glorify himself as Napoleon had. Thus, he establishes the Museum of History of France for public teaching purposes. There were several hundred monumental paintings and sculptures that he commissioned, along with busts that the king is going to see as glorifying the country and its unique patchwork of pasts. In order to leverage the country's history, he moves this museum of the Gallery of Battles into the Palace of Versailles, opening in 1837. Here, dedicated to all the glories of France, we find that each period of French history had glorious moments, and so we're not trying to state that one is better than another. So he's trying to make everyone happy again, just as juste-milieu artists did. Whether that be royalist, revolutionary, or imperial, everyone has an episode of history they can be proud of. Now, it is not a repository of objects, as you would think of a history of a natural history museum, but instead is a gallery of paintings of historical events that people can appreciate. The most important of these various galleries is the Gallery of Battles, with 33 scenes that are left intact here in Versailles to this day. The scenes begin with the foundation of France itself, with the Merovingian king Clovis I, who ruled between 481 and 511 Common Era, and ends with the most latest king, Louis-Philippe. Here we find that Clovis I, leading the Franks and the head of them, is going to battle the Alemanni in German-Belgian frontier in 496. Here in a documentary quality, we are minimizing the supernatural elements that we see before in the same episode. Here we have the Battle of Tolbiac of 1881 seen a bit later, in which you have divine intervention on the side of, once again, the king himself. Here, we know that he admired Delacroix, Richefeu did, and we have this medieval subject matter and a dynamic composition that can be considered romantic. But he also studied with neoclassical artists like Guérin, whereby linearity, as you can see here, every figure has a clear outline, and subdued colors were considered classical. Thus, we have a good example here with Richefeu and the juste-milieu, and this particular battle showcasing a happy medium between the two and the foundation of France itself. Another artist who would be working on these major battle scenes would be Horace Vernet, who produces 4 of them and many smaller works in a journalistic approach. Here, in the Duc d'Orléans on his way to the Hôtel de Ville in 1830, we have a painting that showcases an historical event while minimizing the role of the future king here. Louis-Philippe, who's going to have the tricolor riding into the town hall at this time. So this is days after the revolution in 1830. Now, the previous historical paintings, as you see, would glorify a leader, such as Napoleon on the battlefield. But in this instance, we find the leader is pushed off into the background, de-emphasized very purposefully. So it is less blatant a propaganda for the future king, because the purpose is instead to record an historical event. So Louis-Philippe, the Citizen King, is showing himself here as a leader among equals. He is not forefront, he is not largest in the painting, nor is he directly in the center. As a matter of fact, he's in the background. The central element instead is the tricolor. Thus we are imitating or mimicking his uniform. That's what draws us to him, not, once again, the fact that he's in the center or is the largest. Thus, the goal of this new king was to unite France by pointing out the connections from past and present that's going to shape, even though there is a patchwork of backgrounds and political parties, that will satisfy everyone. Now, after Napoleon's death in 1821, there was a flood of literature on him, turning the emperor into a legendary figure or a secular saint. Hence, you have the Napoleonic cult that was strengthened by the Bonapartist movement. Therefore, Louis-Philippe curried favor with this middle-of-the-road style of politics by finishing monuments begun under Napoleon, one of which was the largest triumphal arch in Western Europe. One of these monuments was the Arc de Triomphe, left unfinished in 1815 with the overthrow of Napoleon. This becomes a major project under the July Monarchy from 1832 to 35. Originally designed by Jean-François Thierry Chalgrin, the monument was left undecorated and unfinished as far as the relief sculptures were concerned. But unlike the low-relief victories that are going to be in the spandrels or the relief panels, those commissioned under the July Monarchy use Romanticism and an emotional dramatic approach with very high relief sculptures. Here, commissioned to decorate the pillars on either side of the Arc de Triomphe, a monument that everyone sees when traveling to Paris today because it's in the center of a roundabout in the center of the city, and you have to go past it to get to any of the major monuments. So a very important structure, originally commissioned by Napoleon in order to showcase that he is like a Roman emperor and has triumphed and won a triumph like Roman emperors before him. Now it is used not to celebrate Napoleon solely, but instead is going to showcase the departure of the volunteers of 1792. This is going to be celebrating the men who volunteered against the Austro-Prussian invaders after the French Revolution left the country vulnerable because the military had been overthrown, the monarchy had been overthrown. So someone needed to protect the city against outsiders. Here we have liberty, again, an allegorical figure, a personification of an idea, in other words, leading real figures below, that being she's not meant to be understood as an actual persona. Instead, she is an idea. Obviously, liberty is, in this case, much more violently leading them, screaming, dressed in military attire with a sword, her sword unsheathed as she is going to encourage the soldiers to move forward. The warriors below, all 6 of them, are not shown in Greco-Roman attire, but instead are going to hearken back to the Gauls, those warriors with long hair and beards that the Romans themselves had fought, thus giving France its name for the ancient Romans, Gaul. So we find that thus celebrating French heritage here in this sculpture, which, like those from the Hellenistic age, are very dramatic, very exuberant, that we are caught up in this charge ourselves to defend France. Now, this is a rare example of actually showing this type of high relief sculpture in a public monument because of how vulnerable these high relief limbs actually are for the test of time, as they can be knocked off or worn down. This being a very dramatic presentation, extremely deeply undercut figures and forms that are so graphic you can see them very clearly from a distance. The figure of Liberty herself, screaming and enraged, driving these men onwards, is very telling of this type of approach. Another monument that would curry favor with the Bonapartists would be the tomb to house Napoleon's ashes in a 17th century veterans hospital. Here we can see the massive porphyry sarcophagus is going to be modeled on previous imperial examples, such as the sarcophagus of Constantina that we have in the Vatican today. Now, this was in a round funeral chamber, which was circular with walls decorated in sculptural allegories of victory and the specific successes of Napoleon, especially his contributions to French society. Here we can see the conservatism of the monumental art is specifically classical. Here's a victory figure, an allegory of victory. Very different from Francois Rude and the departure of the volunteers of 1792, which was very active, though showcasing the same allegory. With this emphasis on conservatism, it's not surprising that some of the major works commissioned at this time of art are going to be religious. Here we have the Church of Saint Germain, which is the oldest church in the city, built in the 6th century. And during the July Monarchy, the church would become major patrons of the arts again. So the religious revival is attributable to the support of the middle class given by Louis-Philippe. Now, the middle class is going to be the most religious. So we have building and restoration projects of churches and new commissions for paintings and sculptures to adorn them. So here, Hippolyte Flandrin is going to be a student of Ong and studying in Rome in the 1830s. He is going to have an interest in early Christian and Byzantine art, which he considered to be uncorrupted, pure Christianity, and develops a new abstract style to showcase and to highlight a more purely Christian approach that would be considered iconic. In his Christ's entry into Jerusalem of 1842, Flandrin is going to give you an example here of one of his mural paintings that seems to be frozen in time with this type of linear frieze composition. Very popular, derived from Byzantine art. Now, not surprisingly, with a golden backdrop and hieratic poses, one can easily associate this with the mosaics at Ravenna and other intact examples that existed in Western Europe up until that day. So here we find that Christ is going to be in the direct center of the composition, undisputably the most important element on the vertical axis, surrounded by a golden halo. We find that there is a horizontal axis, which is the line of heads that are going to run roughly in line with Christ's chest and frame the donkey below him. That gives us a good grid-like pattern that locks the composition in place. So the figures here are going to be taken from the Italian Renaissance, however, specifically from the 15th century before the High Renaissance, when we have overt drama and action being shown. So it is not illusionistic, interestingly enough, like easel paintings. It calls attention instead to the flatness of the wall, this flat stylized approach, seemingly more purely Christian because it harkens back to earlier examples of icon painting in the early Middle Ages. But not all commissions of religious subjects were so classicizing or so retrospective. Others are going to be forward-thinking, like those commissioned from Delacroix, such as at the Church of Saint-Denis sous Saint-Sacrement in Paris. Here we have his Pietà of 1844, very characteristically modeled on Delacroix's patchwork of colors, but based on early Renaissance examples again, specifically from the Northern or the Gothic subject and tradition. The technique as well is not Renaissance. It's not carefully detailed and refined with attention to the anatomy. Instead, we have a much more ethereal and emotional appeal with the presentation of the body of Christ and those holding him up in this spokes of wheel-like composition. Therefore, could we consider this to be a classical versus romantic approach? Well, not exactly, because Flandrin's technique is actually medieval, and Delacroix called himself a classicist. And once again, it also called Flandrin Gothic smears, so it's not as clear-cut as we might imagine. Now, all of the examples we just mentioned, including Louis-Philippe's museum, the Arc de Triomphe, and the church decoration, were all meant for public consumption. Now, the salons were the most anticipated public event of the year, made annually in 1833. After that, submissions soared to over 3,000 visitors that we have here. So we find that visitation is going to be a good symptom of the growing middle class. Here we can find that François-Auguste Biard is going to show 4 o'clock at the Salon, showcasing how crowded this experience was. Now, every newspaper and journal reviewed the Salon each year, and critics were great writers and poets of the day. At the Salon, the grand machines still dominated, but there were more and more small and mid-sized works, which of course is going to be symptomatic of the rise of the middle class. The salons were a marketplace, with catalogs providing artists' addresses. The subjects, again, as mentioned at the outset of today's class, are going to be ones of history painting, Orientalist subjects, that being of the Middle East, landscapes, and portraits. The Napoleonic period had been dominated by the historical genre of painting and catered to the elite group known as the troubadours. In the July Monarchy, there was a fad for historical novella or novels, such as Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame of 1831. History became a form of popular fiction, and thus a new genre came to appeal to this middle-class sensibility. Paul Delaroche was one such artist that capitalized on this new appeal. Here, with the children of Edward, that being Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, in the Tower of London of 1830, we can see Shakespeare's Richard III being illustrated, with the 12-year-old King of England, Edward V, and his younger brother locked in the tower. Both would be murdered by their jealous uncle, the future Richard III. Edward here off to the left is going to be reading while nervously looking off to see if someone is coming to open the door to kill them, while Richard looks morosely out at us. There is a noise at the door. Is death to be imminent or sudden? It is successful, and especially for a middle-class audience, because we have a sentimental appeal here with psychological drama, with a very detailed execution and coloring. Everything that the middle class loved. The juste-milieu here is going to be appreciated by the middle class. It is both very clearly detailed and oriented, but still dramatic, bringing the best of both worlds together, as we've been discussing. So Delaroche would create a market for this new historical approach. Delacroix, on the other hand, would popularize Orientalism. Louis-Philippe, at the same time, was colonizing North Africa in the 1830s, making travel easier, and thus we can gain more information. And with real-life observation, we have the ability to graft on to pre-existing views of the Orient as being opposite of the Occident, or the West where these viewers lived in Europe. So he accompanied Duc de Mornay on a diplomatic mission to Morocco and negotiated a treaty with the Sultan at the time. Now this is before photography, we must remember, so artists documented everything, and that's all the public had to go off of and to understand what a foreign culture would look like. So he created hundreds of watercolors, landscapes, architecture, people, and customs, all of which he's going to record. Here, with the women of Algiers and their harem, we have a very different approach to the understanding of what these harems looked like than just a few years earlier. In it, we have direct observation because he received permission to visit a harem, and it is much less controversial and much less erotic than imagined. It epitomizes Oriental culture here, or what the West would consider moral corruption of the East. These odalisques themselves embody sexual excess and depravity and proverbial laziness. What do they do but lay around smoking hookahs and eating, waiting for their next sexual encounter? So all of this is what the West attributed to all foreign cultures. They believed that all foreign cultures were lazy, that they all were going to have problems with overt and excessive sexuality and depravity. So here we have this idea that exoticism equals eroticism, but this now gives us more information and also is meant to be for the middle class who is uncomfortable with overt nudity. So we have more information and an image that is crafted for this middle class audience. Now, the classical and romantic elements here are going to be adopted in the subject. So while they are not nude, while once again we are not showcasing overt sexuality and violence like the death of Sardanapalus, we still can see the same interest in themes on both sides. Both the classical approach of Ong and that of Delacroix appreciated these exotic and erotic themes. Turning to Arab cavalry practicing a charge of 1832, we have another example of post-colonial kind of discourse and interpretation, which is going to try to show the other as violent. In this instance, we are going to see a counterpart to the massacre at Chios, which shows the Arab, or the Middle Easterner, the Oriental, as they would say at the time, someone coming from the Middle East, as prone to violent action and barbarity. Now here we have this notion that women in the Orient are going to be governed by sexual excess, while men by way of aggression, brutality, and violence. Therefore, the Orient is going to represent for the West passions at a fevered pitch, unable to be controlled by the people who live there. Both of these varieties were quite popular at the time because they played into these stereotypes of men and women of this unknown exotic region. Next class, we'll continue on with landscape, portraiture, and mass media, with the rise of popular culture in the July Monarchy.